Hi D1s, this is your Lab 21 pre-work video. Please pay close attention so you're prepared for your lab project. So we will be doing two operative preparations. For the style of the preparation will be for amalgam, but we're not going to restore both of them with amalgam. We'll restore the OL prep on number 14 with your gray inlay wax, and we will restore the occlusal on number 19 with amalgam. So first let's talk about our preps. The class 1 OL prep on a maxillary first molar follows that lingual groove that comes from the distal pit on the occlusal surface and crosses just over the lingual surface as it runs adjacent to that oblique ridge. So here's what caries can look like on a maxillary first molar. You can see that you often have it in the central pits. We can have it in the lingual groove as well, in the distal pit going across the lingual surface. Sometimes in the case like this upper left photo, the decay will extend from the distal pit underneath the oblique ridge. Ideally, we would like to preserve that oblique ridge, but if the decay undermines it, we don't have a choice in the matter. We have to remove it. But for our prep, since we are not dealing with carious teeth and we are talking about ideal preparations in order to build your hand skills, we will not go into that oblique ridge. Our goal is going to be to preserve the oblique ridge. So let's talk about our preparation. On number 14, we're actually going to do two separate preparations. There's a little small occlusal prep that is on the mesial side of the tooth, mesial to the oblique ridge, and it basically goes from your mesial pit to the central pit, kind of hugging that mesifacial cusp. And then there's a separate preparation on the distal side of the oblique ridge that goes from our distal pit across the lingual surface, extending throughout that lingual groove. When we look at this preparation, we want to think of our specifications. One of the things that's unique about this prep is the pulpal floor depth is 1.5 millimeters, but because we are crossing the lingual surface, instead of staying down in the central groove, the pulpal floor has a slope to it. So it's going to remain 1.5 millimeters, but as we come up toward the lingual surface, we have to slope upward occlusally, and then there will be a drop off to the lingual surface. I have a little bevel here just because we don't want to leave any sharp angles underneath the amalgam preparation. Remember, that's our resistance form. A sharp angle under the preparation could make it more likely to fracture. We want to resist a fracture, and so we will round off internal line angles like that. But this is going to have a sloping pulpal floor. So that means your handpiece, your burr is going to be perpendicular to this cuspal incline as you're going up that lingual groove. And you can stop and check with your instructor to make sure you're heading in the right direction. But as we look further at this prep, we want our pulpal floor depth to be 1.5 all the way across both of these preparations. Our isthmus width should be 1 millimeter. We don't want to get much wider than that because we're trying to preserve this big oblique ridge. And so we need to maintain a very nice, narrow isthmus. We're going to have our divergent dovetail and facial and lingual extensions. On this prep, we have a facial extension at the central pit. We also have one that's cut off here at the mesial pit, and we have a dovetail on the distal. So those will all be divergent, and then all of our isthmus walls are going to be convergent. We also have convergent walls on this lingual box that we'll look at from the lingual view in just a second. The lingual box itself, we want it to be 1 millimeter wide mesiodistally, 1 millimeter depth into the tooth to that axial wall. We also want it to be about 1 millimeter in height. Now, in the real world, on a real tooth, the extent of the lingual box of your preparation would depend on that lingual groove. If that lingual groove extended further gingivally, then your preparation would extend further gingivally. Since we're not dealing with carious teeth, we're going to have a 1 millimeter box depth. So that means all of the dimensions of our box are 1 millimeter faciolingual, 1 millimeter mesiodistal, and 1 millimeter occlusal gingival on that lingual box preparation. The lingual walls are these walls here that are the ones that we want to have some convergence. That's going to help with the retention of our amalgam. So the burrs we recommend you guys using for this preparation, a 329 or 330, are your pear-shaped burrs that give you convergent walls. The 169L is a tapered fissure burr that gives you some divergent walls. These are, if you hold them perfectly parallel to the long axis of the tooth or perpendicular to your occlusal table, they'll give you the right wall angulation of your walls. So we're going to restore this one with your gray inlay wax. And the reason we're doing this instead of an amalgam is that it can be difficult to get the restoration all the way up to these lingual margins, right where it crosses from the occlusal surface onto the lingual surface. And so we want to do that with something very forgiving the first time. And so we're going to use wax, but we want you to have a clean margin and then a very distinct lingual groove that you restore here in this prep. So now let's talk about our mandibular first molar prep. This is another prep that's a little bit complicated because of the anatomy of this tooth. You've just studied the anatomy of your molars, and so we know that this is our tooth with 5 cusps. We have that M-shaped central groove, and so the caries can occur at any of those pits or developmental grooves, and so we often have to do a nice occlusal preparation on these teeth. Again, we'll be doing an ideal preparation, and so an ideal preparation on this tooth is going to preserve all of our cuspal triangular ridges and both of our marginal ridges. Because of this distal cusp's smaller size, we don't have space to do a distal dovetail. We will not be putting a dovetail on the distal. Instead, we have these little Y-shaped extension that goes into the distofacial groove and extends over just toward the distal pit inside the distal marginal ridge. We do have a dovetail on the mesial that just extends a little bit facial, but on the distal end of this tooth, we are not putting a dovetail because it would cut into our little baby distal cusp, which we want to preserve. Again, we're going to have 1.5 millimeter pulpal floor. We'll have our isthmus width at 1 millimeter. We want this isthmus to be kind of smooth and flowing. It should be a nice natural curve going around those triangular ridges. A lot of times when we are new at these, we end up with really boxy or squared off angular looking preparations. And so we want you to work on slowly smoothing those in and getting nice curvy walls. The isthmus walls should be convergent. Our dovetails and extensions should all be divergent. So that's what this will look like. We have our convergent isthmus walls here against those triangular ridges, and then we'll have divergent extensions into our developmental grooves and into our dovetails. So on these typodont teeth, the ivorine is so white and shiny and smooth that it can be difficult to see where the grooves are. So it can be helpful to take a fine-tipped marker or a mechanical pencil and mark the groove so that you can see that pattern really closely. And that will help you keep your burr in the groove instead of going off of the groove. We want to preserve our little distal cusp here, preserve all of these triangular ridges. So here's a video of amalgam placement. I did a demo on an enlarged pedestal tooth just so you could get a little bit closer up view of this. And so I'm going to let you watch that real quickly. Okay, this is just a demonstration of amalgam placement on an enlarged pedestal tooth with a big occlusal prep. First, you want to make sure you have all of your instruments laid out in kind of the order you're going to use them. I'll start with the amalgam carrier, have my dapping dish and the little amalgam capsule popping stick ready to go, have my condensers, my burnishers, then we'll use a couple of carvers. The instruments I use in this video are not exactly the same as those you have in your kit, but they're very close. So we are triturating the amalgam. Once that has spun down, we will remove it from the triturator and use the little white stick. You place it into the end and then just snap it open. When you pour that into the dapping dish, there will be a small ball of amalgam and then a little plastic barrier. You don't need that plastic barrier. Then use your amalgam carrier to load the amalgam into the end. While you're loading it, you do not press the lever. You just simply press down into the amalgam. When you press the lever, it expels the amalgam. And so you're going to do that when you're holding it over your occlusal preparation. And so I place it directly into the opening of the prep and press the lever to expel that material and put it into the prep. We want to slightly overfill it. You want to put a little bit more than you need because as we condense it, it's going to kind of compact like a trash compactor. You're compacting it down to the base of the prep, down to your pulpal floor. And so we want to make sure that we have plenty. Sometimes you'll condense and then come back and add some more. So we're going to take a condenser, and the condenser is used to press the amalgam material all together. We're condensing it to itself and all the way into the base of the prep. And so you use a pretty good amount of force. You use a small condenser to get down into the base of the prep. This can create some little holes or pits, and so then I usually go back with a larger condenser to continue packing the material. And then what you want to do is as you're pressing it down, you're going to feel it kind of vertically condensing. And with the larger end, I want to make sure that I'm condensing it over the edge of the prep margins. I want it to be just past the cavo surface margin. We need a little bit of excess so we can make sure we have those margins sealed. And so with the larger condenser, we're going to be continuing the same type of motion. You'll feel the amalgam start to kind of squeeze together. It even makes a little squeaky sound as you're condensing it. And once you feel like it's no longer moving vertically, it's not squishing together and becoming more compact, that's when you know it's time to move on to creating some anatomy. And we typically like to do this with our different burnishers. The one I have right there is the anatomical burnisher. It's got kind of an acorn-shaped end. Because I have a very large tooth and a large prep, I'm using a larger end. And the shape of this burnisher will create really great anatomy if you use the existing positive anatomy that's left on the tooth to help guide you. So you can see I'm kind of placing the acorn burnisher into the grooves between the cusps, going into those developmental grooves. And as I press sideways, kind of horizontal motion, that is creating my central groove anatomy. You may want to go back. So I'm taking the condenser again and I'm condensing the amalgam up against those margins. I may have moved some of the material away from the margin and I caught that. So I went back with my condenser to, you can even condense a little bit sideways to condense up against the cavo surface margin to make sure there's plenty of amalgam there. And then we will continue placing our anatomy. And so I'm using this anatomical burnisher. Some people like to use the football-shaped burnisher. Some use the ball burnisher. And the burnisher is placing your primary occlusal anatomy. So we're putting in some nice grooves. The central groove, our facial and lingual grooves. I kind of try to trace the positive anatomy. So I'm tracing around those triangular ridges, just like I would do if I was carving a wax up. This anatomical burnisher has to be held perpendicular to the occlusal table or parallel to the long axis. If I tilt it the wrong angle, I can have that sharp point pressing up underneath one of the margins and creating an undercut. And so we want to make sure that you're holding it at the right angle. And you'll just see me continuing to work on establishing that anatomy. So I'm moving the material horizontally with this anatomical burnisher, and at some point as the amalgam starts to set, you will feel like it's no longer moving. And so at that point, I'm no longer really burnishing it and pushing it up against the margins, and so it's begun to set. That's when you know it's time to move on to a carver. And so I use the burnishing step to create my primary anatomy, and then I will go back in with a carver. What I have in my hand there is a discoid end of the discoid cleoid instrument. No, that's sorry, that's the cleoid end. And I'll use the side of that instrument to clean up the margins. And so you can see I'm lining it up, I'm resting it on the positive anatomy, I'm resting it on the triangular ridge and using it to remove excess amalgam that's just over the margin. And we are cleaning those margins with the discoid and the cleoid end. That's the discoid end there. You can use that along the marginal ridge. I find that gives me nice clean margins on my marginal ridge. This particular tooth that I'm working on has a lot of secondary anatomy, a lot of supplemental grooves, and so there's a lot for me to get in there and clean out. But you can see I'm not really changing my groove anatomy. I'm not establishing new anatomy with the carver. I've already done that with the burnisher, and I'm just using the carver to clean my margins. I went back to the anatomical burnisher to kind of refine my grooves, make sure that I didn't mess them up with the carver. Once the amalgam starts to set, you can't really do much with this anatomical burnisher. You'll feel the material is hardening and you aren't going to make much difference with the burnisher after the material has started to harden. So we also can clean off some debris with a small cotton pellet and your cotton pliers. If you get that cotton pellet damp, that will leave kind of a nice finish. And on this tooth, because of all those supplemental grooves, I'm going to try to continue carving and cleaning out those grooves. You can even pick up an Explorer and use it in the really narrow grooves to ensure that you don't leave a bunch of debris in there. And this is not a tooth that you guys are going to work on. I just wanted to give you a kind of a close-up view of the amalgam process overall before you do your first project. Okay. Okay, so when we talk about instruments, I mentioned that you want to have your instruments kind of set up and ready to go because once you triturate the amalgam capsule, you have a specific amount of time before it will harden. So you need to be ready to work and have everything kind of in order. Typically, we work in this order. We'll start with our amalgam carrier. That's the double-ended one with this lever that you can dispense the amalgam into your prep. You have 3 different condensers that are pink and green, and they have different size a condenser on each end. So you'd have a total of 6 sizes. You have 3 different burnishers. The burnishers are red and green, and they've got the anatomical burnisher, which is my favorite, the small ball burnisher. It's just spherical on each end with 2 different sizes. And then the football burnisher. The football burnisher has this football shape on one end and what we call a beaver tail on the other end. Those are all great for establishing your anatomy. And then your carvers, you've got 2 different sizes of the discoid cleoid. You have a Hollenbeck carver, and you also have something called an amalgam knife. Typically, the amalgam knife is good for cleaning up your interproximal surfaces when you do a class 2 restoration. So that won't really apply for your first project. When we go to triturate the amalgam, we have these triturators. We'll have them placed throughout the lab. This is going to take this capsule, which contains a little bit of liquid mercury and the powder metal components that need to be mixed together to create our amalgam. When you place it in the triturator, it shakes and spins. And so this is mixing the solid and the liquid together to create our amalgam. Our manufacturer's recommended settings on the material you guys are using is called Valiant PhD. And typically we will triturate for 7 seconds plus a 3-second centrifuge. You'll see that those settings here, and your instructors will help you with that. But the time of trituration will vary depending on what kind of amalgam you're using. If it is a capsule with more than one spill, sometimes you get a double spill or a triple spill. That just means double or triple the amount of amalgam that will come out. And then the triturator itself. So work with your instructors on using the right setting. Once you have triturated, you're going to open the capsule. Each of you got a box of Valiant PhD capsules, and you have a little white stick inside. You place that stick into the opening on one end of the capsule and pop it open. And then you will put your amalgam into your small end of your dappen dish. The dappen dish can go both directions. You can have a large opening on one end or a small opening. We want a smaller end. You don't need that little plastic barrier. You can discard that or just leave it on your brown paper. The amalgam carrier is what you're going to pick up the amalgam out of the dappen dish with, and some people like to fill both ends at one time so that you can take more and dispense it into the tooth. You want to dispense enough so that there's a little bit more than you need, so it's overfilled. When you begin condensing, you're going to be vertically compacting the amalgam down to the base of the prep, all the way down to that pulpal floor. Make sure you condense it all the way across the pulpal floor. You'll start with a smaller condenser, and then as you work toward the cavo-surface margin, you can use a larger one to overfill over that margin. You also may want to condense both laterally and vertically. Laterally helps you push it up against the facial and lingual margins of your isthmus. So looking at your condensation tools, you have 3 different sizes. I've only got pictures of these 2 different ones, but you're going to use a variety of sizes on each restoration. When we move on to the pre-carved burnish, burnishing is also going to continue condensing the amalgam material. It pushes the amalgam up against the margins of the preparation, but it helps us establish our occlusal anatomy. The amalgam will be relatively soft when you start burnishing, so you don't need to press very hard, and then you'll gradually increase your pressure as you feel the amalgam setting. You can use the ball burnisher, the football burnisher, or the acorn burnisher. On little small preps, that small ball burnisher is really good for putting in a nice fossa. When we go to carving, carving is not necessarily meant for putting occlusal anatomy in. You're really establishing your occlusal anatomy with the burnishing, and the carving is just meant to clean up the margins. Okay, so you're brushing away the excess amalgam from the cavo surface margin on on your amalgam restoration. So typically I will burnish until I feel that the material is no longer moving horizontally. I'm not pushing it up against the margins, and that tells me it's time to stop and move on to my carver to refine my margins. And then we want to finish it off with a nice damp cotton roll or cotton pellet. This just helps remove scratches from the surface and leaves a nice smooth finish. Dr. Miller did a sample prep and restoration for you guys with some good photos here, so we'll just walk through the process one more time. This is just checking the fit of the condenser into the prep. You need one of your condensers to fit to the pulpal floor of your prep. If you have a really teeny tiny prep and your isthmus is not wide enough for the smallest condenser, you will need to widen the isthmus. You'll need to go back to the handpiece and drill that isthmus a little bit wider so that you can condense all the way down to the pulpal floor. Then we've mixed up our amalgam. We're picking it up with the amalgam carrier and placing it into the preparation. We're going to slightly overfill it so that we have enough material at the edge of the margins. Then we're going to condense it with the smallest condenser to start, vertically compacting it down to the pulpal floor. We can also condense laterally up against the facial and lingual isthmus walls to make sure that we have sealed the margins. Once we have that condensed and we have it slightly overfilled over our margins, we'll move on to our burnishing. This is using that football-shaped burnisher to establish some fossa where you might put your negative anatomy. I like to use that acorn burnisher to put grooves and pits in. We will clean up the margins with a discoid cleoid. This is a discoid end. You can also use a sharp-ended carver like the Hollenbach carver. You can use an explorer tine to clean your margins. There's another sharp-ended carver that will create some nice, clean, smooth margins. And then we will smooth it with a damp cotton pellet to leave this matte finish. So the proper finish for an amalgam restoration is this dull matte finish. We do not want it shiny and gleaming and reflecting a bunch of light. That means it's been over burnished. And so we want to start with this nice matte finish and not something that's super shiny. At the end of your amalgam restorations, you will need to dispose of all of your amalgam particles. So typically what we'll ask you to do is take your brown paper, remove all of your other instruments and just have the amalgam waste on there, roll the paper up so that you can take it to the amalgam disposal containers and put in the leftover amalgam powder, the capsule, the little plastic barrier that came with that so that we properly dispose of that since it contains mercury. You guys will learn a little bit more about that from Dr. Kramer. And that's all I've got for you. Thanks for watching.